What is burnout? What is mental fatigue? What is really happening in the chemicals in your brain?
Burnout is you're being drained by your work. That's mental fatigue, goes on and on until your brain eventually says, I'm giving up. Enough, I'm not doing this anymore. I had a guy he had grown faster than I'd ever seen anyone grow. He was very proactive, and we had regular coaching sessions about what he can do to really propel his growth. And in his performance review, I was told I have to give him some criticism of something he needs to do differently. In the research, it's been known for decades and decades. It's called the idiosyncratic rater effect, that when one person rates another person, the data is nonsense. It reflects the person doing the rating more than the third person being rated.
Exactly. The reason you would experience something like that is actually because you care a lot. Yeah. You are, in and of yourself, incredibly special and enough.
This is why we started in enThriven, right? Because we both experienced how
and this episode is close to both of our hearts because we're talking about mental fatigue and burnout, something that we have both experienced in our lives. And the main purpose of this is today we want to talk about what is the science behind it, what's happening in your brain, and the physiological consequences of it. There are real mental health to biological links and the consequences, long-term consequences of it. And we want to dispel some myths and hopefully also some strategies that helped us recover. And we hope that this will be beneficial for you out there who are listening, if you happen to be experiencing it, or even just as a warning for you to recognize certain things and to avoid it altogether. So both Duncan and I have experienced it in our own personal ways, which we'll both share about a little bit later. But what was interesting to me is that recently a former colleague came to me, and because for me, I experienced it 2 years ago, probably the worst episode 2 years ago. It was something that I knew or was very well versed in, and I had spoken to a lot of people. I accepted that it was endemic. But when my colleague came to me, I realized that it wasn't really being spoken about in the workplace. And so that's what we want to bring out today. When she came to me, she shared about that she was feeling mental fatigue, and she couldn't really quite even identify what it was. But she simply said to me that she couldn't produce as she knew she could. And she was so far past this, she couldn't understand why something that would normally take so much less time was taking 3 or 4 or 5 times longer than it normally did. And for me, I identified the symptoms of burnout and mental fatigue, but she didn't even have the vocabulary around it. She didn't understand what was happening to her. And then she further said something that really struck me. She said, I don't know if other people around work are experiencing it. No one seems to be talking about it, and I'm afraid to talk about it with my manager. And I immediately told her a few things. One, you are definitely not the only one experiencing this. Considering the stats out there, what was it?
Yeah, so it's I think it's almost 3 in 4 people will experience or do experience burnout some of the time or much of the time.
Yeah, and the amazing amount of disengagement stats out there, there's no way that you are alone. But it is sad to me that people are not sharing about it. And it really boggled me that she thought that she was alone, that something was wrong in her. And she was scared to bring it up because she felt like, does this mean that, I'm weaker than others, or there's something wrong with me? Or does this mean ultimately that there might be, and I've heard this term specifically used by other people to say, well, now that I've taken or I want to take some time out, that I have a target on my back. Well, the thing is, all of these things, they create an environment of obviously fear and inability to really identify this for yourself, especially when you're deep in it yourself. And so I really hope today that we can share our personal stories and especially some of the things that we have really learned out of this. So the first thing is what is burnout? What is mental fatigue? What is really happening in the chemicals in your brain?
Yeah, so burnout is well, there's debate in the research, but a lot of researchers view burnout as the opposite of engagement. Right? Engagement is you're coming to work with proactive energy, you're being energized by your work. Burnout is you're being drained by your work. That's mental fatigue. It goes on and on until your brain eventually says, "I'm giving up. Enough. I'm not doing this anymore," and that's burnout.
We're only just starting to talk a lot more about mental health at the workplace, or mental health in general. And people are starting to become much more aware, not just about the need to pay attention to mental health, but the link between our mental health and our biology, the physiological link. So there are studies that show the real long-term physiological cost of not taking care of our mental health. Got it.
And it kind of sneaks up on you, right? Burnout, like um, for me, so I come from South Africa. In South Africa, there's a lot of stress, right? I'd had people try and stab me on the street, and I kind of thought I could handle pretty much anything. I can just tough it up, right, and get through it. But this thing that happens in the workplace, one of my managers said to be a good manager is to identify weaknesses and focus on them, right? Being under that all day, every day, where you're getting signals like no, 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 all the time, it sneaks up on you, and you sort of drain from energy until eventually it's just suddenly like, no, like your colleague said, like I'm looking at the screen and nothing is going in. My biggest advice for people is like, don't think that you can brave your way through it. Don't wait for it to collapse, because some people never recover from burnout.
Yeah, and you were telling me about real life cases that you know about.
Yeah, so I know of people who have had high powered jobs in multinationals, burnt out to the point where they can't do much more, take much more stress than a job at a charity store or something, right? It's their brains are literally burnt out. It's going to take a long time to recover.
So that this is not at all a statement of your cognitive ability. These are just very natural things that happen in the chemicals in your brain that have physiological long-term consequences. And there are studies that that are coming out that show not only does it have mental health issues, obviously, but there are long-term risks to overall lowering your immunity, cardiovascular disease, chronic pain, and it's one thing to affect ourselves as well, but eventually, if we're not the best of ourselves, the people around us suffer as well. So there are just secondary, tertiary effects to all of these things. So one of our
And addiction, right? But one of an interesting thing is the neural pathways that deal with physical pain also deal with mental and emotional pain. And so what dulls physical pain typically also dulls mental and emotional pain. And so which is why very often anti-anxiety and antidepressants are also painkillers, right? It's the same neurons. And so people will turn to things like alcohol or drugs because it's like it, as far as our brains are concerned, it's the same as being under physical pain. And if it goes on long enough, you mentioned chronic pain, you start to develop chronic pain, and then you're on medications, and then you can get addicted to the medication, and it's just a vicious cycle.
Right, because your brain is not getting the dopamine hits that it's getting from other things, so it's going to crave that any way, cheap way it can get. Right. Here's a couple of things that I want to go into of what I learned. The first is that we need to reframe burnout. I discovered in my personal journey that when resilience and strength and accountability went from my strength to my greatest enemy, because I'm the kind of person that would think, okay, if if plan A didn't work, then I would go to plan B and C, and then I would go to D, E, F, and I would continue doing all of these things. And then I realized, okay, the reason why I'm not succeeding, I can't break through these walls, is because I didn't try all these other things. And so it's my fault. It's my fault that I didn't do better stakeholder management. It's my fault that I didn't do such and such and such. But the truth of the matter is that if you spend all your time trying to push down these walls that will not budge, it is going to cause you mental fatigue and burnout, and it shouldn't be there in the first place.
I'm almost willing to bet that those weren't actually walls that you were being told in reviews, like this is a role, do this better, do that better, you didn't do this well enough, because that's how performance reviews often work, right? It's yeah, I actually had a senior above me. Um, I had a guy he had grown faster than I'd ever seen anyone grow, right? Really fast. He was paying attention to those loves in work, and grown extremely fast. He was very proactive, and we had regular coaching sessions about what he can do to really propel his growth. And in his performance review, I was told I have to give him some criticism of something he needs to do differently. And I'm like, but we've been having weekly meetings about what he needs to do. He's doing exactly what I've been asking him to do, and it's working. And the response was, no, but you've got to give him some room to grow. As if the only way he can grow is to find something that's negative and something that's critical that he has to do differently. And it was just so silly, because what he's doing is growing phenomenally fast, right? Incredible progress. And it's this that we have to give people signals like, you did that wrong, you did that wrong, you did that wrong, don't do that. And that withers our neurons, drains us of energy until eventually our brains shut down, right?
Yeah.
So I'm willing to bet these weren't actually walls that are all over the place, like this didn't work, that didn't work. I'm willing to bet that actually there was all sorts of things that were working in there, but the management style is focus on weaknesses and point out people's faults, and you get this message, nothing's working, until, because you care, you eventually burn out. Well, so one of the things I wanted to say is, when I was going through this, I felt like that's it. I can't do anything anymore, right? And when we first met, I can't remember how it came up, but you mentioned that you'd gone through burnout, and that really surprised me, because you're one of the most capable people I've ever met, right? And I was like, oh my goodness, this person's gone through burnout. And then you'll remember I kept asking you, like, how did you deal with this and how did you deal with that? And that was a massive help for me, to kind of come out of that slump.
That's one of our hopes as well with this episode is when we were able to talk to each other and realize, hey, other people have experienced this and they are, strong, incredible, very smart people. What we want you to know, especially, is that not only is it nothing to do with you and does not have any statement on anything that you are not good at or your cognitive ability, but more importantly, you are definitely not alone. And that the more that we talk about it, the more that we can know that other amazing people are also experiencing it. How can we help each other? For me, when I discovered, I think where I ended was one day it sort of struck me. I was down to Avenue X, Y, and Z, and I kept on telling myself, well, it's all my fault because I couldn't do this, or clearly I wasn't meeting the right expectations, or something like that. And only when I kind of realized that if I could clone two more of me and we worked around the clock, and I still wouldn't be able to finish everything that I needed to do or satisfy everybody, was when I realized there's nothing I was going to be able to do. I couldn't outwork this. And when it really, really drove in was when I ended up in the hospital. And I had to have emergency surgery. And there's no definite proof that what had happened was directly caused by stress. Of course, we can't really know the exact causation. But I did experience something that ended up my going to the hospital that day and having to have immediate surgery. And that was actually, I, I don't want to reinforce any kind of dramatic thing where you have to end up in the hospital and have this, paradigm shifting realization. I don't want people to go through that. But it was a reminder to me that not only, I don't want the cliche term to be like, oh, is this really worth it? But to recognize that, like, if you could double or triple your work and it wasn't really going to accomplish, then you can't outwork this.
Because there's a tendency to someone who's very productive to give them more and more and more and more and more until they break, right? I've seen that happening to incredibly productive people, and then higher up say, oh, get them to do this and this and this and this. First of all, those things that they're now being made to do aren't things that they're getting into the flow for. So it's things that are draining them. But you can't just load somebody up and up. And the reason this came to mind is I've seen that happen to someone to the point where you could see it was draining them. They were really struggling, and then their health broke down. Also ended up in hospital for a physical thing. So yeah, I think it's something we need to be very careful about watching out for.
I think another myth that we want to kind of dispel is that actually the reason you would experience something like that is actually because you care a lot. Burnout is not a lack of dedication or a weakness. In fact, it is the opposite. Burnout is that you are a dedicated employee who wants to do good work. And because you cannot do that, or you're blocked from doing that in some way, that constant signal to your brain is what is causing that mental and physical health issue.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you talk to a lot of people, and there's people who work in these corporate environments, and they seem to do fine. And very often I talk to them and say, like, how do you manage it? And they say, oh no, you have to switch off, right? You have to disengage yourself, right? Because otherwise it'll destroy you eventually. And I actually remember being told once, basically, you need to learn, as a manager, you need to learn to treat people just like numbers and not to care. And I can remember making the conscious decision, like, that's not the sort of person I want to be. I have to be able to live with myself and go to sleep at night. I don't want to be that sort of person. But I ended up burning out, right? Because I was in this environment where you were expected to do that. And it would have protected me if I had disengaged and not cared. But then also, I don't want to be that sort of person. Looking back, I should have just got out of the situation a lot sooner than I did. Right? And that's really what the issue is.
Yeah. So either way, like fighting too hard or disengaging, either way are just not solutions to this. But just to recognize that burnout, if anything, or mental fatigue, is that you are incredibly resilient. You're an incredibly dedicated person. You care about your team, your people, or what it is that you do. And this is completely natural, and is nothing to do with what is wrong with you. And lots of people around you are experiencing it. You are most definitely not alone. But it's more of a negative take. I think the more important take.
Well, before we come into the positive, like I think we're having a looming crisis here, because under 35-year-olds, so sort of up and coming younger generation, 50% of them are so stressed at work that they can barely function, right? And that's going to translate into really an epidemic of burnout and mental health issues in the not too distant future.
So I think coming from that, the second thing I really want to communicate, and one thing that I've also learned, is that part of burnout comes from the conflation of self-identity and your output. You are not what you do. And this is a great opportunity to sort of reflect. For me, it was a great opportunity to step back and wonder, how did I allow my workplace and the people around me, my performance, to undermine my identity and my confidence? I actually got to a point where I thought I had peaked. This was the end for me. I couldn't learn anymore. I clearly could not do anything else. And I thought, I'm in my 30s. How did I peak? How did I completely just, hit a wall? And I totally thought that I clearly can't learn anymore.
And that's interesting, right? Because you're getting these no signals all the time. To learn, literally, is neuroplasticity. We talk about this all the time. You have to be doing something you love. You have to be getting signals like, yes, that worked. Well done on that thing, to get that dopamine spike and the acetylcholine, so that you have neuroplasticity, so that you learn. When we have these situations, these systems where we're just looking at faults all the time, literally you get to the point where you can't learn anymore, right? That's what's happening in the brain, because you don't want to, if you're doing things that are wrong, you don't want that to be reinforced, right? So your brain shouldn't be adapting and learning from that. It should be withdrawing. So literally, you start to feel like you can't learn anymore.
And what's just crazy about this, right, is that I want to bring up a fact that you talked about in another episode, which is that we are a network of 1 billion neurons and over 100 trillion neural connections that we have learned over the course of our lives. And what is even more fascinating about this is that if you are a really special connection of over 100 trillion, that only you are built or wired that way, it also means that nobody in the history of humankind was ever like you, and nobody in the future of humankind will ever be like you. You are singularly enough, important, unique, incredibly, mind-bogglingly is what you always say, mind-bogglingly unique.
And I think what's also really important about that is that no one can look from the outside at you and tell you what you're about, right? That can only come from you, right? What you can be great at. No one else, someone else can say, oh, it looks like you did that really well, or it looks like you were energized when you do that, and maybe have a coaching and a conversation about it. But no one can from outside look at you and say, this is you, right? That's something that only you can see from the inside.
So, what I wanted to point out from all of this is that, if you can be such an incredible connection of things that you have learned over time, and even, not very many people have taken the time to even study themselves and really invested to really know who you are, right? That you are, in and of yourself, incredibly special and enough. You are not your social media, you are not the performance metrics. You are not what you produce at work. Those are great things, and the way you impact the world certainly is fulfilling and important. But whether or not you do, you are still, in and of yourself, whole and really special. And that is backed up neurologically by science.
And the absurdity of it, right, is not only can no one else look at you and say this is what you're about, but in these work situations we get judged by these performance metrics, and sometimes it's politics and it's games, and companies do these mass layoffs, and they use performance metrics to do that, right? But regardless of all of that, even almost all of these performance management systems and performance metrics are me evaluating you on something. Like, this is how you score out of 5 on this thing or that thing. And in the research, it's been known for decades and decades. It's called the idiosyncratic rater effect, that when one person rates another person, the data is nonsense, right? It reflects the person doing the rating more than the person being rated. Like, I think in the research I've read, it's between about 55 to 70 something percent is the rater, me rating. I carry my pattern of ratings, and only about 30 something percent is actually reflects you, and it's impossible to know which 30 something percent. Right? So even people do 360s, it's just adding more bad data. So this signal that you're getting, that you're not good enough, it's not working, that's defining you. Like, literally, scientifically, we know it's rubbish, right? It's bad data, and but that's the signals you're getting.
And that's what's practiced a lot at work, right? And it's where we spend a lot of our time. So let's turn our attention a little bit to, like, what are certain practical actions that helped us get out of this? Because that's the most important thing. And for me, one of the best things I did, and I didn't even know I was doing it, I didn't know the research at the time. But one great thing to kind of get out of that mental fatigue is something called an effort-driven reward cycle. So I looked around when I left my work. I had just bought a property, and I had not had time to really nest. So I looked around, there was, empty spaces, and I decided that I wanted to build. And I knew nothing about building. And without realizing, I had chosen to teach myself something that I didn't know anything about. So I started kind of woodworking, and that actually hit on a number of things. Firstly, I was working with my hands. And so there is research behind doing something productive with your hands that also gives yourself a mental break. If you're in the highly cognitive industry, for example, a knowledge worker, to do something where you can tangibly and also visibly see a result is really healing for you.
Yeah, and when you're in that burnout state, you're ruminating. So you've got all these negative thoughts going around in your head, which are not helping. So I guess that helps you clear that out because you're focusing on something.
Yes, doing something as well with your hands where you just have to give 100% of focus. And I found as well, like building was really meditative because you're kind of doing something and creating something, and it gave me, in a weird way, a meditative state. So when people talk about breathing or meditation, in a way, that was kind of my meditation, breathing. But at the end of it, I got to build something that today I can touch, and I think, oh, this is beautiful, and I built that. So effort-driven reward cycle. Start small, a tiny thing, that you may or may not be something you've always wanted to work on. Let's say photography, cooking, whatever that is, something you wanted to learn. But preferably something that's, if you were in a highly cognitive role, hopefully something not as cognitive, like, I'm not going to make any decisions for everyone, but maybe like learning programming might be a little too much. And if you don't succeed, it might, really strike your confidence again. But if you were to produce something, even just a beautiful cake, for example, and to be able to experience it, see something that is beautiful and even taste it, your body sees this kind of thing that you created, from scratch, and you kind of tell yourself, it reinforces that you did something incredible. So that really helped me rebuild my confidence when I didn't even realize that my confidence was absolutely shot. Um, the second thing is, I think that a lot of people go through this self-recrimination of what was wrong with me. They go through guilt. And when they say, if you're going through burnout, and let's say you take a medical leave, for example, or you stop for a minute, you have to reprogram yourself from being extremely productive in a day to suddenly stopping everything, and you again you evaluate yourself based on what you produce. So you're suddenly going through this narrative of like, what's wrong with me? How come I can't get out of bed? Why can't I do things? But we need to reprogram, or we redefine what it is that success is, first of all. But if we settle ourselves into this like self-recrimination, negative narrative, and guilt, and we settle into this loop there, we never get out. But it's unproductive. So if you feel a certain way, if you think, well, I can't seem to get out of bed, that's fine. Don't.
Rest for a
Um,
while.
yeah, allow yourself, give yourself permission to rest, and it is okay. So I just refused to entertain any guilt. When I first stopped, there were days when I just wanted to sleep forever. And I thought there was something physically wrong with me. I did hormonal panels, I did all kinds of tests, I did blood tests, thinking there must be something really wrong with me. And I just wanted to sleep. And some days I couldn't get out of bed. I wanted to Netflix and eat pizza in bed. And then I got to a point where I just said, okay, fine. If that's what I want to do, then I'm just going to do that. Get rid of the guilt. Do not entertain it, and allow yourself to be that way.
Yeah, and what something that's interesting is people, when they first go onto anti-anxiety meds, if they do, so some of them do have drowsiness as a consequence, but sometimes when you first go on, you crash, absolutely crash for some days. And the reason is that anxiety, that stress has prevented your body from resting for so long, right? And maybe it was 10 years or more than 10 years, a long time. And then when you start taking the anti-anxiety meds, suddenly that goes away a bit and your body says, I have an opportunity to rest, and it grabs it, right? And so you just crash. Um, it's not the medication doing that. It's the fact that you haven't rested for so long and you just need to rest.
Um, Actually, one thing that really helped me was someone sent me this quote while I was in my rest form. And it was saying that your body's need to rest is not a sign of something wrong with you. It is that after you've been in a state of stress and fight or flight or survival mode for so long, finally your body has shifted into a place of safety, that it has given permission to rest and it's releasing all of your exhaustion all at one point. And it is not a sign of something wrong. If anything, it is your body's finally acceptance of you're out of survival and into safety.
Yeah. What's just coming to my mind here, and this might be a bit off topic, but I'll say it anyway, is the Jewish practice of sitting Shiva. That when there's a tragedy, the person has a month where they're not doing anything. The blinds are drawn, they're not getting made up, they're just resting, right? And there's stages, but you basically you're just resting. And I suspect that there's some wisdom in taking that sort of practice to this, right? You burn out, give yourself X number of time where you tell yourself, I'm not going to accomplish anything, I'm not going to do anything, I'm just going to rest for this time, and take that time to just rest.
And I know that, for some people that could be a bit of a privilege to just stop entirely. You're thinking, well, how am I supposed to do that if I have responsibilities at home? And absolutely, we have to do what we do, but as much as possible, do not give yourself any kind of self-recrimination that you can't seem to do the things that you know that you're capable of doing. I'm usually capable of doing, 50 things in a day. Why can I only get down to 5? That's okay. So for me, there were days when I gave myself one goal for the entire day. And that goal could be getting out for a 15-minute walk, or that goal could be doing laundry. And if I had done that for the day, that was a big win. But even if I didn't, I would not tell myself, oh, what's wrong with you? Why didn't you get it? This sounds so simple. Why couldn't you just do that? I wouldn't tell myself that. I had to pull myself out of that narrative and just say, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Do it tomorrow. It's fine. So yes, set yourself one thing, but even if this is not, again, a performance metric, do not evaluate yourself on it. Just something to just get you out of bed and do that. The third thing is I invested in myself, fitness-wise. So I will still say to this day that hiring a fitness trainer was the best money that I spent. But I know not everybody can do that. And I afforded whatever I could afford at the time. But if you can get a buddy or have a partner that can just get you out of bed for a 15-minute walk, it's good to just get out. Because the problem is sometimes there's a temptation to just certainly stay in bed and rest for what you need, but there's a temptation to continue being in there and never getting out. And so just getting up, standing up, going outside, getting some fresh air is really recuperating. So those are kind of very, practical, small things. And we're going to close up this episode, but the key takeaways here are the first thing is that we want to point out again is burnout requires a reframing, that it is not a weakness or anything that is wrong. If anything, it is actually in your strengths becoming your greatest enemy, that you are a dedicated, incredibly strong, incredibly passionate person who cares about what you do. And because you're so resourceful and accountable, that actually you're turning that on yourself. So don't allow that to become a factor of guilt or self-recrimination for yourself. And there are real physiological, mental, emotional facets and consequences to it. Secondly is to prioritize self-compassion and slowly rebuild confidence by doing small things and really making the effort-driven reward cycle your friend in small ways. And this is also why it's really important. I know that it's endemic now. It's happening, and not obviously talked about.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. But if you, if this is not what you're experiencing, and that is great news, this is also here to educate people to identify situations where you can get out of it, or you can help yourself before you get to that point. Don't end up in the hospital. And finally, I just want to encourage everybody who's listening today. You are incredible. You are special. You are enough. You are whole in and of yourself. You are not what you do. You are not your impact in the world. You are not your performance metrics, and you are not your social media account. And you are certainly not alone if you are experiencing this. And to accept that rest and recovery are very much natural cycles for ourselves, that we are physical and mental beings, and we need to respect not just each facet of that, but how they work together. And finally, that we need to break the stigma around burnout and mental fatigue and talk about it with friends, with people who are trusted, and if necessary, call your boundaries for yourself. Going back to the story with my colleague, I advised her that if what she needs is a moment out to go and talk to a doctor, get medical leave, and tell her manager. And you are not, at least in the UK and Ireland, you are not legally required to divulge the reason for your medical leave. So you don't need to tell them that it has anything to do with anything physical or mental. You are allowed medical leave, and that is it. And so I advised her to go and speak to her manager. And she got that time off for a moment. And even if it's not necessarily going to solve everything, still taking that time out for yourself is still better than continuing and burning yourself out even more.
Yeah, it can have serious consequences.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add to this?
No, you've said it great.
All right. Well, thanks very much for joining in. Yeah, and we'll see you next time.